canon for the Fate franchise is a bit of a touchy subject in the Fate and Type Moon communities. It's riddled with alternate universes and technicalities. Today I kind of want to clear some of those things up for people, just because while yes, there is a deep system that explains much of what's going on in the Type Moon as far as timelines go, it's not exactly useful for any more casual enjoyers of Fate, because they really just want to see the canon entries, and those are very few in comparison. It gets confusing. So let's get this out of the way for superfans. Nothing is canon and everything is canon. This is how Nasu particularly explains away plot holes in major Fate works. Is a character slightly off between stories? Do events not fully match up between the entry you're watching or reading and a 10-year-old piece of media? Well, the solution is simple. All of these take place in slightly different universes where things were ever so slightly different. This will seem intimidating to most casuals, so let me explain this in a way relating to a Star Wars... So let me explain this in a way that... So let me explain this in a way that might be a little bit more understandable. Think about Star Wars. In Star Wars, each trilogy has a distinct and different tone and feel, because none of them were made with the knowledge that later entries would follow. And they didn't know what would be in those later entries. So you get things like Obi-Wan and Vader having a... So we have to fill in the blanks for things such as somehow going from the prequels to Obi-Wan and Vader fighting like old men's with, as if they were poking each other with fragile sticks. Or another one with Obi-Wan, how he recounts that he and Anakin were good friends and like brothers in the Clone Wars. Whereas if you actually watch the prequels, it doesn't line up with that depiction at all. This is what you typically consider a plot inconsistency or a plot hole. Nasu doesn't really want those, though. So he tells people to imagine it as sort of in all of these different entries are being told in their own pocket universes following similar events. So while the larger events are the same, the things leading up to them or the individual details of those events are slightly different. On its own, this wouldn't, or at least this, on its own, this probably wouldn't be so confusing of a concept, beyond, well, semantics, except that it's often conflated with the far more drastic Fate multiverse that exists, predating. On its own, this wouldn't be such a big problem, except it's often conflated with the much larger and more drastic Fate multiverse. And that's without accounting for future spin-offs that don't even stay in line with the original canon or attempt to. On its own, this wouldn't be a particularly confusing concept to grasp, beyond, well, semantics, except that it's conflated with the far larger and far more drastic Fate multiverse. And this exists predating even leaving canon. So even the original visual novel falls into this. And that's its own can of worms. And that's before breaking into the spin-off material that doesn't even try to connect to the original timeline. So because of that, you kind of have a recipe for infighting over what the proper timeline actually is, or whether or not there even is one. Today, I kind of wanted to provide, at least the casual fans, the closest thing you can get to a canon Fate timeline. Or, should I say, canon Fate timeline. First things first, though, because these are some of the entries that casual fans may be aware of, either because they have big anime presences, or they're just as big as some of the main timeline stuff, I wanted to go ahead and knock out some of the major works that you might be familiar with, and just flat out say they're not part of the canon. The first one I'm going to cover here is Fate Apocrypha. You might have seen this because the anime does have its own sort of following, I think. The anime and by extension the light novels are a completely alternate universe that, while illuminating some elements of the canon Fate Stay Night timeline, they're not intended as a prequel, sequel, or midquel. Despite being arguably larger than the original Fate Stay Night, Fate Grand Order is only an alternate universe. So rejoice! You don't have to play the gacha game to experience the complete story, if that's what matters to you. Next up is sort of the big Fate video game, Fate Extra. This is the one with Red Saber. It can kind of function as a sequel to Fate Stay Night in a tangential sort of way, but it conflicts with enough and is so far unrelated to the original plotline that you could just kind of ignore it, so I'm not going to touch on that one any more than that. Finally, we have Tsukuhime. This is sort of Fate's sister series, but it only connects to Fate after really overcomplicating things. These are all great entries in their own right, and you really should experience them if you've got the time and you're looking to get into them. But as far as the Fate canon is concerned, they're not ones you need to concern yourselves with. Alright, so now time to get on to the guide to the actual Fate canon. Alright, time for the first thing ever produced that can be considered canon to Fate. And it's not actually Fate. I told you this would be simple, guys. Garden of Sinners is a series of Japanese novels and animated movies that were written by Kanoko Nasu, the father of the Fate series.
Daddy. I'm sorry. Myself.
He's also the namesake for the term Nasuverse. The characters of this book and film series slowly do begin to weave into the larger Fate canon, but as they stand, this is actually probably the work that needs the least amount of introduction, because it predates Fate. It's not Fate. It's a completely standalone work that doesn't even lead into Fate on its own. So you don't really need to worry about the canon as you're reading these. But because it is pretty blatantly canon at this point to the larger Fate universe, or at least the larger Fate Stay Night timeline, then really they're worth a look, especially if you plan to continue past the obvious ones, which we'll be getting to in a minute, actually. Next up is the franchise namesake, Fate Stay Night, the one this guy is from. Here's where the confusion starts, though. This visual novel and the anime are split into 3 alternate, equally canon routes. In some of them, this guy dies. In some of them, actually, never mind. So, yeah, but they have different events that will be referenced in canon or won't be referenced in canon. There is sort of a grand, overarching, actually canon route that we don't see that includes aspects of all of these, and everything can be referenced in future works. But no one route will reference all of it, so it's kind of its own beyond our imagination thing, so you kind of have to fill in the blanks as you're going forward. This is all so that the routes, nothing in future events renders any one of these routes not canon. So they're all kind of treated ambiguously as canon. Alright, so the next entry we're looking at here is Fate Hollow Ataraxia. It's kind of a smaller scale sequel to Fate Stay Night. That said, this one's only in visual novel format for the moment, and it's about 80% fan service comedy, so don't feel bad if you can't experience it. I know I haven't, at least, but from what I've heard, if you are able to experience it, it is one of the best type moon works, people say. And it does contribute to canon. It introduces us to some characters that will be referenced in future works, and were referenced in Fate Stay Night, but maybe didn't have the chance to develop or weren't actually all that present in the story itself. It also provides some extra backstory as to what actually the fuck happened in Fate Stay Night, because much of that isn't touched on too much in Fate Stay Night, outside of a little bit in one of the roots. Okay, time for the big one. Fate Zero. This entry is the one that got a lot of people into Fate, and some people say it saved the franchise. I can go either way, just with the anime itself, but I think we've way moved past that era. It is probably the entry that leads to the most, like, is this canon? This is a little bit inconsistent, because it has a bit of a prequelitis sort of thing going on with it. So that's why you kind of have to take it as it is. It's a darker story, and it's the first Fate canon work not written by Nasu so far. Instead, it was helmed by Gen Urobuchi, known mostly for his world-class ball-kicking skills, and his pastime of murdering little girls. It is a prequel to Fate Stay Night, and regardless of what a lot of the community may tell you, don't try to overthink its canon status, as most later entries directly reference it, and it's as much canon as any individual Fate route is. Alright, time for another one that's a little bit weird. Mahotsukai no Yoru, or Witch of the Holy Night. This one is another visual novel, but it's a remake of an unpublished novel that Nasu wrote. A lot of the concepts and characters he would later use started here, including a major character from Garden of Sinners and other canon Fate entries. It sort of serves as an origin story for them, and like Garden of Sinners, it can function as a standalone work. If visual novels aren't your thing, well, it is getting an adaptation into a movie by Ufotable, so keep an eye out for that. But this one, functionally for a lot of people, it's going to work more as a prequel to Garden of Sinners at the moment. It does function mostly like that. So if you skipped Garden of Sinners for whatever reason just to get into the straight meat and potatoes of Fate, then this one might not be one you should check out anytime soon. Maybe save that till you're ready to look at Garden of Sinners. Next up is Seki's personal favorite entry so far, The Case Files of This Guy, Lord El Malloy II. This is a prequel dash midquel to Fate Stay Night, and a sequel to Fate Zero. It was written by Makoto Sanda, the author of Ancient Magus Bride. It's a series of mystery novels and an anime series that... This is a series of mystery novels, as well there is an adaptation into an anime that adapts one of the arcs and has its own extra content. It's sort of a bite-sized Fate thing that serves to flesh out the larger Fate world in the canon timeline. It's also a good jumping-off point if you're interested in non-canon or non-canon Fate spin-offs, as many characters here are reintroduced in those other works, or are reintroduced here from those other works. And this is how they're usually folded into canon. It's got its own merits. Seki seems to really like it, so I can only highly recommend it if the Fate wider universe at all interests you, and if you like that kind of London mage aesthetic going on in the series.
The Sherlock Holmes aesthetic.
Oh yes, I almost forgot. She's in it as well. Do it for waifu. Now time for an entry that is dubiously canon and will likely be stricken from canon in the near future, so I'm sorry for this. I only say this because it's not finished yet, and it can always choose to wave its dick high and declare itself a truly alternate universe in its final volume, or a later series we'll talk about could decide it doesn't want to try to blend with these, because it could be a little bit rough in the future to blend them. But so far as it looks, it is mostly a sequel to Fate Stay Night and takes place so far the latest out of any entry in the timeline. It takes place after Fate Stay Night and follows a reproduction Grail War in America. It was written by Ryogo Narita, who is known for writing a little-known anime called, Durarara? Or kind of a niche series called Bakeno.
You mean Bakano?
Bakeno, thank you, Seki. It's more important for its connections to the case files of Lord Elmaloy and its sequel, which we will get into later. As there are some Fate characters that return here, but the biggest returning characters are pulled from that specific spin-off. I won't spoil it for you, but let's just say it ties in more with Fate Stay Night and Fate Zero than you might think at first glance, too. That said, both Nasu and its own writer Narita have declared it a parallel universe at this point. Specifically, in one of his novels at the end, they make that finally clear. So, it was done so to sort of remove the restraints of having to adhere to constant canon, as well as having to keep the writer of this guy's series from having to constantly reference it. It's unknown whether or not that's going to be more of a Fate Zero kind of role, or this is just not canon Fate Apocrypha kind of role. That has yet to be made fully clear. I imagine in either this series or this guy's series, it will be made quite apparent. But if you want to experience the closest thing we can get to Fate canon, this is worth at least checking out as a sequel to Fate for now. Regardless of how canon it is, it's also really good, and I encourage you to give it a shot. Now, if it remains dubiously canon, which I suspect it will not for very much longer, then I'm going to footnote here that it has a hilariously weird sort of FGO tie-in as far as the timeline goes. So, if you're an FGO fan watching this video, give it a look. There's a plot point that might amuse you. That said, this isn't me telling you if you watch this as part of Fate canon to go play FGO. Do not do that. It's nothing worth it. Alright, now time for another entry that isn't called Fate, but is definitely canon. Garden of Avalon. This is a somewhat obscure entry into the Nasuverse, as it was only a single novel written by Nasu. It is probably the most canon thing to the timeline at the moment, by far, with zero strings attached, unlike literally every other entry we've discussed so far. It's a retelling of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table told in the Fate universe, in some ways. It's more like vignettes of different parts of that, I believe. I haven't read it myself or listened to the drama, but there is a book, and then there's an audio drama of it, I believe. It's worth reading for the backstories of various characters you'll see from Fate and Arthurian legend, and it is directly canon and can be sort of seen as the Arturia prequel to Fate. Alright, here's a pretty recent one. The Adventures of Lord Elmaloy II. This is a sequel series to the case files of this guy, written by the same author. It takes place roughly a few years before where Strange Fake is supposed to take place, and a few years after Stay Night. It is, in theory, supposed to directly lead into the events that have been referenced to take place farthest in the timeline, past even where Fate's Strange Fake ambiguously sits. If anything renders Strange Fake irreconcilably non-canon, it'll be this. So, if you're trying to remain as firmly canon as possible, this is the story to follow, not Strange Fake. This is the entry that folds the original Fate Stay Night characters into the Elmaloy storyline, and folds a few more of the Garden of Sinners characters in as well. That said, it's brand new and has zero adaptations, and I imagine the light novel translations haven't even started yet, given we're not even done with case files. So, good luck finding a way to read this anytime soon. But in half a decade, when the series translations are caught up, expect to hear a fair bit on this one from Fate fans, as this is the newest produced work we have received in the so far concrete Fate canon. Alright, I know I just said that's the newest one, and that is 100% the truth. This work straight up doesn't exist yet, but is being hinted at and will probably exist eventually. Let's just say it's effectively a direct sequel to Fate Stay Night that sort of brings all of this horrifying mess back together to conclude the story of the Fuyuki Grail War. It's been hinted at by Nasu and other writers that this will likely be written once Adventures of Lord Elmaloy II and possibly Strange Fate, probably not, are done, but don't hold me to that quote. Please don't badly age things, Twitter. Now that we have all entries into the Fate canon timeline, let me map them out for you in canonical order for people that care about that sort of thing. Earliest in the timeline is rather obviously Garden of Avalon, being largely a retelling of Arthurian mythology. Following it is Mahotsukai no Yoru, Witch on the Holy Night. After that is Fate Zero, then Garden of Sinners, Kara no Kyokai, then Case Files of Lord Elmaloy II, followed by your pick of the Fate Stay Night roots, or all of them. Then Hollow Ataraxia, followed by Adventures of Lord Elmaloy II, dubiously followed by Fate Strange Fake, concluding with whatever story eventually ends up telling the tale I told you of before that was not written yet. Congratulations, you now know every entry in Fate canon, as far as we currently understand it. As to where to start, well, go watch my video on the subject, but if you are specifically trying to experience Fate canon, I recommend starting with Fate Stay Night, Fate Zero, Garden of Sinners, or Witch on the Holy Night, as these require the least knowledge of the franchise to understand, whereas the other entries in some way rely on a little bit of familiarity or attachment to some of the characters. But that does it for me. If you want more Fate stuff, let me know in the comments. I'm trying to satisfy the demand for this by writing more of these videos, and it's nice to know a gauge on how many people are interested in non-Seki Reacts Fate videos. I'm open to...
I'm a goddamn treasure.
I'm open to suggestions on future videos or remarks if I got something wrong or missed something. Let me know if you like this. I could easily do a guide on the wider expanded universe beyond the Stay Night timeline, so let me know in the comments, please. Also, remember to like and subscribe and all that YouTube stuff, so we can have validating emotional satisfaction of seeing our numbers go up. Well, ta-ta, folks.